The year was 1888, and in the high-stakes marriage market of Victorian London, one mistake could cost a woman her life. Lady Beatrix Weatherby made that mistake. Standing in the shadows of a crowded ballroom, she heard a man speak a unforgivable truth about her family. Blinded by rage, she didn't just confront him, she struck him across the face in front of the elite. She thought she had defended her honor. She was wrong. She had just assaulted the man holding the mortgage to her father's estate. And the punishment wasn't prison. It was marriage. This is the story of how hatred became obsession. London. October 14th, 1888. The air inside the ballroom of the Duchess of Richmond was thick enough to choke on. It smelled of expensive French perfume, melting beeswax, and the underlying metallic scent of desperation. Lady Beatrix Weatherby adjusted the emerald silk mask over her eyes, wishing she were anywhere but here. To the casual observer, Beatrix was just another debutante in a sea of pastel silks and ostrich feathers. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that had been let out twice and retrimmed with lace from her mother's wedding dress. It was a costume of wealth hiding the rotting reality beneath. The Weatherby family was ruined. "Smile, Bee," her younger sister Lydia whispered, clutching Beatrix's arm. Lydia was 18, soft and terrified. She knew just as Beatrix did that tonight wasn't a party. It was a hunt, and they were the bait. "I am smiling, Liddy," Beatrix murmured, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Keep your chin up. Don't let them smell the fear. It excites the wolves." Their father, Baron Thomas Weatherby, was currently at the whist tables, likely gambling away money they didn't have. He had pinned all their hopes on Beatrix, securing a match this season. But Beatrix was 23, a spinster by London standards, and possessed a tongue too sharp for the fragile egos of the local gentry. Needing a moment to breathe, Beatrix slipped away from the crushing throng of the dance floor. She navigated toward the library wing, a dimly lit sanctuary usually reserved for men smoking cigars and discussing politics. She intended only to hide behind a velvet curtain and catch her breath for 5 minutes. She had just settled into the shadows of a heavy oak alcove when the library door creaked open. 2 men entered. Beatrix froze. The heavy smell of tobacco smoke drifted toward her. "It's a tragedy, really," a voice sneered. Beatrix recognized it instantly. It was Reginald Crowe, a wealthy merchant's son who had tried to court her the previous year. She had rejected him, and he had never forgiven the slight. "The Weatherby estate is practically rubble. The Baron is drowning in debt." "Is it that bad?" a second voice asked. This voice was deeper, resonant, dark like burnt sugar. It was a voice Beatrix did not know. It commanded the air in the room. "Worse," Crowe laughed, the sound grating against Beatrix's nerves. "The old man is trying to hawk his daughters off to cover his gambling tabs, specifically the eldest Beatrix. But honestly, who would take her? She's stubborn, opinionated, and frankly buying her would be like purchasing a horse with a broken leg just to get the saddle." Beatrix felt the blood drain from her face, then rush back in a torrent of fire. The second man remained silent for a long moment. Then the deep voice spoke again, cool and detached. "A horse with a broken leg can be shot. A wife, unfortunately, must be fed. If I acquire the Weatherby debt, I'll likely evict them. The land is valuable. The people on it are expendable debris." Expendable debris. Something inside Beatrix snapped. The humiliation of the last 3 years. The hunger she hid to ensure Lydia ate the patches on her dresses, it all boiled over. She didn't think. She stepped out from behind the curtain. "You speak of human lives as if they were lines in a ledger," Beatrix cried out, her voice trembling not with fear, but with fury. The two men spun around. Reginald Crowe looked terrified, his face paling. But the second man, he merely turned. He was tall, towering over 6 feet, wearing a black domino mask that covered the upper half of his face. His jaw was strong, shadowed by late-night stubble, and his mouth was set in a grim line. "Lady Beatrix," Crowe stammered. We didn't know. Clearly." Beatrix spat, ignoring Crowe and stalking toward the tall stranger. She stopped inches from him. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He just looked down at her, with eyes that looked like frozen steel behind the mask. "Eavesdropping is a poor habit, little spy," the stranger said softly. "It leads to hearing things that hurt." "And speaking cruelty is the habit of a coward," Beatrix retorted. "You speak of my father, of my family, as debris. You, sir, are no gentleman. You are a monster in a silk waistcoat." "I have been called worse," the man said dryly. "Usually by people who owe me money." The arrogance, the utter lack of shame. Beatrix's hand moved before her mind could stop it. Smack. The sound was sharp, echoing off the mahogany bookshelves. She had slapped him, hard. Her palm stung from the impact against his jaw. Reginald Crowe gasped, backing away into the shadows. The tall stranger didn't move. He didn't raise a hand to strike her back. He slowly lifted a gloved hand to his cheek, touching the spot where she had hit him. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to dangerous. He took a step toward her. Beatrix refused to retreat, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "You have spirit," the stranger whispered, leaning down so his breath brushed her ear. "A pity spirit doesn't pay bills. Pray we do not meet again, my lady, for your sake." He turned and walked out of the library, his black cape billowing behind him, leaving Beatrix shaking, breathless and terrifyingly aware that she had just made a very powerful enemy. She didn't know his name, but she would never forget his voice. The Wetherby Estate, Hampshire. 2 days later. The carriage ride back to the country had been silent. Baron Wetherby had refused to look his daughters in the eye. When they arrived at Wetherby Hall, the true state of their affairs became undeniable. Half the staff had been let go in their absence. Dust sheets covered the furniture in the east wing. Beatrix sat in the morning room, nursing a cup of tea that was more water than leaves. She was still replaying the scene in the library. She hadn't told anyone, not even Lydia. The door opened and her father entered. Baron Thomas looked 10 years older than he had last week. His skin was grey, his hands shaking as he held a letter. "Beatrix, sit down," he said, his voice hollow. "I am sitting, Papa," she said gently. "What is it? Is it the bank?" "The bank sold the mortgage," Thomas said, sinking into a chair. "They sold it yesterday morning. The new owner. He demands immediate settlement. We don't have it be. We have nothing." Beatrix set her cup down, her heart hammering. "Who bought it? Surely we can reason with him, ask for an extension." Thomas laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Reason with him, Beatrix. The debt was purchased by the Earl of Kincaid." The name sucked the air out of the room. Samuel Blackwood, the Earl of Kincaid, the industrialist. They called him the Iron Earl. He was a man who had built a fortune in steel and railways, rising from a scandalous, impoverished childhood to become one of the richest men in England. Rumours swirled around him like soot. They said he had driven his own brother to suicide. They said he had no heart, only a calculator where his soul should be. Kincaid, Beatrix whispered. He evicts tenants, Papa. He turns estates into factories. He made an offer, Thomas said, staring at the floor. Beatrix blinked. An offer to buy the land. To forgive the debt entirely, Thomas said. He looked up, tears in his eyes. In exchange for a wife. Beatrix felt the room spin. A wife. He needs a connection to the old aristocracy to secure a seat in the Lords, Thomas explained rapidly, desperate to justify it. He has the money, but he lacks the lineage. A Weatherby bride gives him that legitimacy. He wants to buy me, Beatrix said, her voice flat. Like a broodmare. He asked for a daughter, Thomas corrected. He didn't specify which one. Beatrix looked out the window to the garden, where Lydia was picking the last of the autumn roses. Lydia who cried when she pricked her finger. Lydia who dreamed of a poet husband who would read to her by the fire. If Lydia were sent to a man like the Iron Earl, she would wither and die within a year. Beatrix stood up. Her spine straightened. She thought of the man in the library, the debris comment. If the world was going to treat them like commodities, she would be the most expensive commodity on the market. No, Beatrix said firmly. Lydia will not go. B, you cannot. I will do it, Beatrix interrupted. Draft the response, Papa. Tell the Earl of Kincaid that Lady Beatrix Weatherby accepts his proposal, but tell him I have conditions. Lydia's dowry must be secured in a separate trust untouchable by him or you, and my mother's jewelry stays with me. Thomas wept. He came forward to hug her, but Beatrix felt stiff in his arms. She wasn't a daughter anymore. She was the payment. She stared at the wall, her mind drifting back to the masked stranger in the library. At least she thought this Earl of Kincaid cannot be worse than the man who called my family debris. I will marry the Earl. I will take his money, and I will ensure he never breaks my spirit. She had no idea that the monster in the library and the monster she was about to marry were the exact same man. Blackwood Manor, London. 1 week later. The engagement dinner was a formal affair held at the Earl's London residence. The house was terrifyingly grand. It lacked the warmth of the Weatherby estate. Everything was black marble, cold steel, and modern gaslighting that hissed softly in the silence. Beatrix wore her best dress, a deep crimson silk. She held her head high as the butler announced her and her father. Baron Weatherby, Lady Beatrix. They stepped into the drawing room. It was vast, dominated by a roaring fireplace. Standing by the mantelpiece with his back to them was a man pouring a drink. Lord Kincaid, Thomas said, bowing low. We are honored. The man turned around. The world stopped. The floor seemed to dissolve beneath Beatrix's feet. He was tall. He had a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. His eyes were the color of frozen steel. There was no mask this time, but the face was undeniable. It was him, the man from the library, the man she had slapped. Beatrix's breath hitched in her throat. Her hand instinctively flew to her side, clutching her skirts to stop them from trembling. Oh God! Oh dear God! Samuel Blackwood, the Earl of Kincaid, set his glass down on the mantelpiece. His gaze swept over the Baron, dismissive and bored, before landing on Beatrix. He froze. For a second, just a fraction of a second, Beatrix saw a flicker of surprise in those cold eyes. His gaze narrowed, analyzing her face. She wasn't wearing a mask now, and neither was he. He recognized her. She knew he did. He walked toward them, moving with the predatory grace of a panther. "Baron," Samuel said. His voice was that same deep, burnt sugar baritone that had haunted her nightmares for a week. He extended a hand to Thomas, then turned to Beatrix. He didn't bow. He stepped close, invading her personal space, just as he had in the library. "And this must be the Lady Beatrix," Samuel said. He reached out and took her hand. His skin was warm, his grip firm. He raised her hand to his lips, but his eyes never left hers. It was a challenge. "I know who you are," his eyes said. "My lord," Beatrix managed to choke out. She tried to pull her hand away, but he held it fast for a moment longer than was proper. "Your father tells me you are dutiful," Samuel said, a smirk playing on his lips. "I must say I am surprised. I expected someone more docile." "Appearances can be deceiving, my lord," Beatrix said, finding her voice. If she was going down, she would go down fighting. Just as a man in a fine suit may disguise a brute. Thomas gasped. "Beatrix." Samuel didn't get angry. His smirk widened into a genuine, terrifying smile. "Indeed," Samuel said softly. He released her hand. "Dinner is served. Shall we?" He offered her his arm. Beatrix looked at the crook of his elbow like it was a viper, but she had made a bargain. She placed her hand on his arm. As they walked toward the dining room, leaving her father trailing behind. Samuel leaned down. "You have a strong right hook, Lady Beatrix," he whispered, so only she could hear. "I still have the bruise." "And you have a blackened soul, Lord Kincaid," she hissed back, staring straight ahead. "I suppose we are a perfect match." "Careful," he murmured, pulling her chair out for her. "I bought your debts, Beatrix. I own the roof over your head. You may have slapped me once and survived. Do not mistake my patience for weakness. You are in my world now." "I am not afraid of you," she lied. Samuel sat at the head of the table, the candlelight casting long shadows across his face. He raised his wine glass. "To the future!" He toasted, his eyes locking onto hers. "And to the lessons we are about to teach one another." Beatrix drank. The wine tasted like ash. She was trapped in a cage with the beast, and the door had just been locked. The wedding had been a blur of icy formalities. Beatrix had stood before the altar in a gown of stiff white satin that felt like armor, repeating vows to a man whose jaw still bore a faint yellow bruise from her own hand. Samuel had looked devastatingly handsome in his mourning coat and utterly remote. He spoke his vows with the crisp efficiency of closing a business deal. Now the guests were gone. The heavy oak doors of the master suite at Blackwood Manor had boomed shut behind them, sealing them in a deafening silence. The room was cavernous, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in heavy velvet. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing nervous orange shadows against the walls. Beatrix stood by the fireplace, still in her wedding gown, her back to the room. She was trembling, though she would have died before letting him see it. She heard the heavy tread of his boots on the Persian carpet. He stopped a few feet behind her. "You can dispense with the martyr act, Beatrix." Samuel said, his voice tired. "I'm not going to attack you." She turned slowly. He had removed his tailcoat and waistcoat, his white shirt unbuttoned at the neck, revealing the strong column of his throat. He looked powerful, dangerous, and strangely human. "You purchased a wife, my lord," Beatrix said, tilting her chin up. "I'm here to pay the debt." Samuel let out a short, harsh laugh. He walked past her to a side table and poured 2 glasses of brandy. He held one out to her. "Drink. You look like you're about to faint, and I have no desire to call a doctor on my wedding night. It causes talk." Beatrix hesitated, then took the glass. Her fingers brushed his. The contact sent a jolt through her arm that she resented. She took a large gulp. The liquor burned pleasantly all the way down, steadying her nerves. "Why did you go through with it?" she asked, the liquor making her bold. "After you knew it was me. After what I did." Samuel swirled his brandy, staring into the amber liquid. "Perhaps I admire a woman who defends what is hers with violence. It's a trait I understand. Or perhaps—" He looked up, his grey eyes unreadable. "I simply enjoy breaking thoroughbreds." A chill ran down her spine. "I'm not a horse to be broken. We shall see." He finished his drink in one swallow and set the glass down with a sharp click. "You will take the bed. I have business in the city early tomorrow. I will sleep in the adjoining dressing room tonight." Beatrix blinked, stunned. You aren't staying." His lips curled in a mockery of a smile. "Disappointed, Lady Kincaid? Do not worry. We need an heir eventually. But tonight I have no appetite for unwilling sacrifices. Get some sleep. You'll need your strength to run this house. It's a fortress, and the staff are loyal only to me." He turned on his heel and walked into the dressing room, closing the door firmly between them. Beatrix was left alone in the vast bedroom. She sank onto the edge of the bed, confusion warring with relief. He was a brute, yes, a cold-hearted capitalist. But he was not the animal she had feared. He had given her a reprieve. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, chilly rhythm. It was a cold war fought in the corridors of Blackwood Manor. Samuel was rarely home before dark, spending his days at the steel mills or the stock exchange. When they dined together, the conversation was polite, sparse, and loaded with unspoken tension. Beatrix, determined not to be a useless ornament, took over the management of the household. The staff, initially suspicious of the aristocratic intruder, slowly warmed to her practical nature. She didn't treat them like furniture. She learned their names. It was during the 3rd week of her marriage that the first crack appeared in her perception of Samuel Blackwood. Beatrix was down in the kitchens discussing the weekly menus with Mrs. Croft, the cook, when a young boy no older than 7 hobbled in. He wore a leg brace made of heavy metal and leather, dragging his left foot with a painful scraping sound. "Master Leon," Mrs. Croft exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "You shouldn't be down here. Does your uncle know you're out of the nursery?" The boy looked up, his eyes huge and grey, the exact shade of Samuel's. Beatrix's heart stopped. "Uncle," Mrs. Croft looked uncomfortable. "This is Leon, my lady, the master's nephew, his late brother's boy. He lives in the East Wing." Beatrix had never been told about a nephew. Samuel had never mentioned him. Before she could ask more, the kitchen door swung open and Samuel filled the frame. He looked exhausted, coal dust dusting the shoulders of his fine wool coat. He stopped dead when he saw Beatrix, his expression hardening. Then Leon saw him. "Uncle Samuel." The boy shuffled forward as fast as his brace allowed. To Beatrix's utter astonishment, the Iron Earl, the man who called people debris, dropped to one knee. The hard lines of his face softened instantly. He caught the boy, gently steadying him. "Leon, what have I told you about those stairs?" Samuel's voice was gruff, but lacking its usual icy edge. It was warm. "I wanted a biscuit. Leon whispered, leaning into Samuel's shoulder. Samuel sighed, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, wrapped peppermint stick. "Biscuits are for after dinner. This will have to do." Leon beamed, snatching the sweet. Samuel stood up, swinging the boy easily into his arms, carrying him as if the heavy brace weighed nothing at all. He looked over the boy's head at Beatrix. The mask was back in place, his eyes cold again. "My lady." He nodded curtly. "My lord," she whispered, completely thrown. He carried the boy out of the kitchen. Beatrix turned to Mrs. Croft. "His brother's son." "The brother who killed himself, yes?" Mrs. Croft said sadly. "Gambled away everything he had. Left the boy with nothing but that twisted leg. The master took him in 5 years ago. Paid for the best doctors in Europe for that leg. He dotes on the boy, though he'd fire me for saying so. He's the only person the master is soft with." Beatrix stood in the steamy kitchen, her mind reeling. A man who rescues a crippled orphan and carries peppermint sticks in his pocket was not the same man who threatened to evict her family. Which one was the real Samuel Blackwood? 6 weeks into the marriage. The confusion gnawed at Beatrix. She found herself watching Samuel when he didn't know she was looking. She saw the way he absent-mindedly rubbed his jaw when he was tired the spot where she had hit him. She saw the way he treated his workers when they came to the house. He was demanding blunt, but never unfair. He paid them well above the London average. The tension between them in the evenings had shifted from hostility to a strange, charged curiosity. He had started asking her opinions on the news and seemed genuinely surprised when her analysis of the Corn Laws was as sharp as his own. One rainy Tuesday, Beatrix was searching for a book in Samuel's private study. He was supposed to be at the exchange, so she felt safe entering his sanctum. The room smelled intensely of him, leather tobacco and sandalwood. She was on a ladder reaching for a volume of Keats on a high shelf when the door opened below. Beatrix froze. She was hidden by the high back of a leather armchair and the shadows of the upper shelving. Samuel walked in, followed by Mr. Henderson, his chief legal counsel. "The nerve of the man," Henderson was saying, pacing the floor. "Reginald Crowe is telling anyone who will listen at the club that you strong-armed the Weatherbys, that you bought Lady Beatrix like chattel." Beatrix's breath hitched. Samuel slammed a ledger down on his desk. "Let him talk. Crowe is a mosquito, annoying but insignificant. But Samuel, your bid for the peerage. Appearances matter. Why did you take on the Weatherby debt in the first place? It was a terrible financial decision. The estate is bleeding money." Beatrix peeked over the top of the chair. Samuel was standing by the window, looking out at the rain. "Do you remember that night at the Duchess's ball, Henderson? Before I announced the engagement?" "Vaguely. Why?" "I was in the library. Reginald Crowe was there. He was gloating about the Weatherby ruin. He called the old baron a fool and said Lady Beatrix was a broken horse no one would want." Beatrix clapped a hand over her mouth. Those were the words, the exact words. "Vile little man," Henderson muttered. "Indeed." Samuel said, his voice dropping lower. "I despised him for it. Kicking a family when they were down. It lacked dignity. It lacked honor. So I decided to mock him. I adopted his hateful tone. I repeated his vile sentiment about them being debris right back to him just to show him how ugly his own thoughts sounded when spoken by someone with real power." Beatrix felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her on the ladder. "No." "And then?" Samuel chuckled darkly. She burst out from behind the curtain like an avenging fury. "She thought it was me. She thought those were my words. Lady Beatrix was there, Henderson asked aghast. Oh yes, she gave me quite the lecture on humanity before she nearly dislocated my jaw. Samuel touched his cheek, a strange softness in his tone. She was magnificent, terrified, shaking like a leaf, but she stood up for her family against two men she thought were monsters. I knew in that second that Crow was wrong. She wasn't broken. She was unbreakable. That's why I bought the debt Henderson. A woman with that kind of fire, she shouldn't be allowed to fall into the gutter. Beatrix couldn't breathe. The tears came hot and fast, blinding her. She had been wrong. Everything she thought she knew about the inception of this nightmare was wrong. He hadn't been insulting her family. He had been satirizing the man who was. She had slapped the only person in that room who had any respect for her. She tried to climb down the ladder silently, her vision blurred with tears. Her foot slipped on the rung. Crash! A heavy bronze paperweight knocked off a shelf, hit the floor with the sound of a gunshot. Samuel spun around. Who's there? Beatrix half fell off the final rung, landing awkwardly on the Persian rug. She scrambled to her feet, wiping furiously at her wet cheeks. Samuel stared at her, his face paling. He realized instantly what had happened. Beatrix, how long have you been there? You didn't mean it, she whispered, her voice cracking. In the library. You weren't insulting us. Samuel's jaw tightened. He hated being exposed. He hated vulnerability. Does it matter now? The result is the same. It matters to me. She crossed the room toward him, stopping inches away, looking up into his startled grey eyes. I hit you. I judged you. I've hated you for weeks because of a mistake. You had reason to hate me regardless, Samuel said stiffly. I forced you into this marriage. To save me, she corrected him, her heart pounding. You just admitted it. You did it to save me. She reached out her hand, trembling, and placed her palm gently on his jaw, right over the spot she had struck him weeks ago. His skin was warm, rough with stubble. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. His eyes searched hers, the icy facade, cracking wide open, revealing a desperate, lonely intensity beneath. Samuel. She breathed his name for the first time, without malice. For a moment, the air between them crackled with unsaid things. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. It was an admission of need, so profound it terrified them both. Then the study door banged open again. James the butler stood there, looking flustered. My lord, my lady. I apologize, but there is a gentleman here insisting on seeing Lady Beatrix immediately. He says it is a matter of life and death. Samuel pulled back from Beatrix's touch, the mask slamming back down, though his eyes remained turbulent. Who is it? Mr. Reginald Crow, sir. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Samuel's expression darkened into terrifying menace. Get out of here, Beatrix. Samuel commanded, his voice low and deadly. Go to your room. I will deal with Crow. No, Beatrix said, wiping the last tear away. Her resolve hardened. She was done hiding. She was done misunderstanding. He asked for me. I will see him. Reginald Crow was pacing the drawing room, looking like a damp rat in a fine suit. His eyes darted around the opulence of the Blackwood home with undisguised envy. When Beatrix entered, followed closely by a brooding Samuel Crow, stopped and offered a greasy, triumphant smile. Lady Kincaid, or should I say Lady Beatrix, you look well fed. Marriage to the industrial machine seems to agree with you. State your business, Crow, and get out of my house, Samuel growled, stepping to Beatrix's side, a solid wall of protective fury. Crow laughed nervously. "Tetchy, aren't we, Kincaid?" "My business is simple. I have come across some information. Information that would make the Prime Minister very hesitant to offer a peerage to the Iron Earl." "Spit it out," Samuel said. Crow turned his gaze to Beatrix. "You know I couldn't believe my eyes that night at the Duchess's ball. Little Beatrix Weatherby, striking a man. And not just any man, but the great Samuel Blackwood. It was quite the show." Beatrix felt the blood drain from her face. You saw that?" "I was right there, my dear, hiding in the corner you forced me into. I saw everything. The insult, the slap, the fury." Crow checked his fingernails idly. "Now imagine if the London Times got hold of that story. Iron Earl assaulted by shrewish wife before wedding. It paints a picture, doesn't it? A picture of a chaotic, violent household. Not exactly the stable foundation the Lords require. It was blackmail, pure and simple. Samuel's entire political ambition, the respectability he had fought his whole life for, hung in the balance. "How much?" Samuel asked, his voice flat. £50,000, Crow smiled. "In cash, by noon tomorrow." £50,000 was a fortune. Even for Samuel it was a significant blow. But more than the money, it was the humiliation. "And if I don't pay," Samuel asked, "then tomorrow's headline will ruin you both. You'll be the laughing stock of London. And Lady Beatrix, well, she'll be social pariah." Samuel moved so fast, Beatrix barely saw him. He grabbed Crow by the lapels of his expensive coat and slammed him against the wall, lifting him until his feet dangled inches off the floor. "If you breathe a word of this," Samuel whispered, his face inches from Crow's terrified sputtering, "I will not just ruin you, Reginald. I will dismantle your life piece by piece. I will buy every debt you own and throw you into a workhouse." "Samuel, stop!" Beatrix cried out, grabbing his arm. "He's not worth it." Samuel glared at Crow for a second longer, then released him with disgust. Crow slumped to the floor, gasping for air. "Get out!" Samuel commanded. Crow scrambled to his feet, straightening his crumpled cravat. He was shaking, but his venom remained. "You have until noon tomorrow, Blackwood, or the world knows your wife is a violent harpy." He fled the house. Silence descended on the drawing room. Samuel walked to the window, his back rigid. "I will pay him," Samuel said quietly. "It won't impact the household accounts. You have nothing to worry about." Beatrix stared at his broad back. He was going to pay a blackmailer £50,000 to protect her reputation, to protect a lie. "No," Beatrix said. Samuel turned. "Excuse me. Do not pay him, Samuel. If you pay him once, he will come back again and again. You know that. The alternative is your ruin, Beatrix. And mine. The seat in the Lords is everything I have worked for. Is it worth your dignity? Is it worth letting a worm like Crow win?" Beatrix walked toward him. The guilt that had crushed her earlier was replaced by a burning clarity. She had started this with her temper. She had to finish it with her courage. "What do you propose?" Samuel asked, watching her warily. "We take the power away from him," Beatrix said, her voice steady. "We tell the truth. Before he can. Tell the truth that you assaulted me." "Yes." She stopped in front of him. "Tomorrow night is the investiture dinner. The Prime Minister will be there. Everyone will be there. Crow will be there, waiting for his money. Yes, we will go, and you will take the stage. And you will tell them exactly what happened. You will tell them that I slapped you because I thought you were insulting my family. You will frame it not as madness, but as honor." Samuel stared at her as if she had grown a second head. "It's political suicide, Beatrix. Admitting my household is out of control. Admitting I was struck by a woman and did nothing. Not if you tell it right." She pressed her eyes blazing. "Tell them you admired my fire. Tell them it's why you married me. Make them see that a Weatherby defending her own is exactly the kind of strength the aristocracy needs. Own the scandal, Samuel. Don't hide from it." He looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. He was calculating angles, risks, outcomes. He was the Iron Earl, the man of business. But as he looked at her, this woman in the sapphire dress who had invaded his home, slapped his face, befriended his crippled nephew, and discovered his secret kindness, he realized business wasn't enough anymore. "You are asking me to gamble everything I've built on a speech," he said softly. "I am asking you to gamble on us," she countered. A slow smile spread across Samuel's face. It wasn't mocking this time. It was dangerous, reckless, and thrilling. "Very well, Lady Kincaid," Samuel said. "Let's burn it down. The Weatherby Townhouse, London. 6:00 p.m. The emerald silk of the gown was cool against Beatrix's skin, but her blood felt like it was running hot with fever. She stood before the tall cheval mirror in the guest bedroom of their London townhouse, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. The woman in the glass looked regal. The dress commissioned by Samuel only days prior was a deep, defiant green, the color of envy. Yes, but also the color of life, of venom, and of storms. It was cut low across the shoulders, displaying the creamy elegance of her skin and the glittering diamond necklace that had once belonged to Samuel's mother. "You look like a queen going to her coronation," Lydia whispered from the doorway. Her sister had come to help her dress, her hands trembling as she adjusted the lace on Beatrix's sleeves. "Or a condemned woman walking to the gallows," Beatrix murmured, touching the cold stones at her throat. "Tonight decides everything, Lydia. If Samuel fails, if the room turns against us, we will be social pariahs by morning. The creditors will descend on father again. The Kincaid fortune will be tied up in litigation and scandal." "He won't fail," Lydia said, though her voice lacked conviction. "He is the Iron Earl." "Iron can break," Beatrix said softly, "if you hit it hard enough." The door opened, and the conversation died. Samuel stood there. He was dressed in full evening tails, a stark black and white contrast that made him look severe, imposing, and devastatingly handsome. He wore no medals. He had none, but he wore his power like a cloak. He looked at Beatrix, and for a moment the mask slipped. His grey eyes travelled from the hem of her emerald skirt to her eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just admiration. It was a soldier assessing his partner before a charge. "Leave us, Lydia," Samuel said gently. Lydia curtsied and fled the room. Samuel stepped into the room, closing the door. The air between them was thick with the unsaid. They were about to walk into the Lion's Den, the investiture dinner at the Grand Hall. The Prime Minister would be there. The entirety of the House of Lords would be there. And Reginald Crowe would be there, waiting for his £50,000 or the surrender of their dignity. "You are trembling," Samuel observed, stopping a foot away from her. "I am terrified," Beatrix admitted, lifting her chin. "But I will not let you see it when we leave this room." Samuel reached out his gloved hand, hovering for a moment, before he adjusted the diamond necklace at her throat, his knuckles grazing her skin. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her that had nothing to do with fear. "Crow expects a broken man and a shamed wife," Samuel said, his voice low and resonant. "He expects us to be cowering in the corner, hoping to buy his silence. When we walk through those doors, Beatrix, we do not cower. We own the floor. We own the air they breathe. Do you understand?" "I understand," she whispered. "Good." He offered her his arm, his elbow crooking sharply. "Then let us go and burn his little world to the ground." The Grand Hall, Westminster. 7:30 p.m. The Grand Hall was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal. 300 of England's most powerful people were packed into the space, a sea of black wool suits and colourful silk gowns, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax, roasted pheasant, and expensive French perfume. The noise was deafening, a roar of polite conversation that hid 1,000 daggers. When the footman announced, "The Earl and Countess of Kincaid," the roar faltered. It didn't stop, but it changed pitch. Heads turned. Fans snapped shut. The gossip had already started. Crow had been busy. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. They say she hits him. They say he bought her. They say the household is a war zone. Beatrix felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her skin. She tightened her grip on Samuel's arm. His bicep was hard as granite beneath the wool. He walked with a slow, deliberate cadence, forcing the crowd to part for them. They moved toward the center of the room. And there, standing near the champagne fountain, was Reginald Crow. He looked triumphant. He was holding a crystal flute, surrounded by a gaggle of minor lords who were laughing at something he had just said. When he saw Samuel, his smile widened into a greasy, predatory grin. He checked his pocket watch, then looked at Samuel, raising an eyebrow. "Time is up," the look said. "Pay me or bleed." Samuel didn't blink. He didn't acknowledge Crow's existence. He steered Beatrix past him toward the dais where the Prime Minister sat. "He looks confident," Beatrix whispered, her lips barely moving. "The confident man is the easiest to blindside," Samuel murmured back. The dinner seemed to last an eternity. Beatrix tasted nothing. The soup was grey sludge. The wine was vinegar. She sat rigid, smiling until her cheeks ached, deflecting passive-aggressive questions from the Marchioness of Salisbury about her spirited nature. Finally, the clinking of spoons against glass signaled the speeches. The Prime Minister spoke first, a droning eulogy to British industry that had half the room stifling yawns. Then the Lord Chamberlain spoke, and then it was time. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," the Chamberlain announced, "I present to you the newest voice in our peers, the Earl of Kincaid, Samuel Blackwood." The applause was polite but tepid. Samuel stood up. He buttoned his jacket with a sharp, decisive movement and ascended the stairs to the podium. He gripped the wooden edges of the lectern, looking out over the sea of faces. He waited. He waited until the polite clapping died down. He waited until the coughing stopped. He waited until the silence was absolute, stretching it, until it became uncomfortable. "Honor!" Samuel began, his voice booming, without the need for a shout. It was a voice of the foundries, deep and commanding. "It is a word we throw around this room like currency. We pin it to our chests in the form of medals. We inherit it with our titles. We claim to defend it with our laws." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, finally locking onto Reginald Crow, who was standing near the back, looking confused. This wasn't the resignation speech Crow had expected. "But honor is not a medal," Samuel continued, "and it is not a title. Honor is an action. It is what you do when the world is dark and you think no one is watching. Beatrix held her breath. Her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. "There is a rumor circulating tonight," Samuel said, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial, deadly serious tone. "A rumor brought to you by a man who mistakes malice for wit. It concerns my wife, Lady Beatrix." A gasp went through the room, a collective intake of breath. To address a scandal so directly was unheard of. "The rumor states that my wife is violent, that she struck me, that our marriage is built on chaos." Samuel leaned forward. "I am here to tell you that the rumor is true." Pandemonium threatened to break out. The Marchioness dropped her fan. The Prime Minister stiffened in his chair. Crow looked ecstatic, leaning forward, thinking Samuel was capitulating, thinking he was about to announce an annulment or a committal to an asylum. "She did strike me," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the rising murmurs like a blade. "She struck me in the library of the Duchess of Richmond's ball, and I thank God that she did." The room froze. Confused silence descended again. "She struck me," Samuel continued, "because she stood in the shadows and heard a man speaking. She heard a man laughing at the misfortune of her father. She heard a man call her family debris. She heard a man strip away the dignity of her lineage for the sake of a cheap joke." Samuel's eyes were blazing now, the grey steel melting into molten iron. "She mistook my silhouette for the speaker's. She stepped out of the darkness, terrified, shaking with no weapon but her hand and her heart. She did not know she was striking the Earl of Kincaid. She only knew she was striking a bully. She risked her reputation, her safety, and her future to defend the honor of her blood." He took a step back from the podium, opening his arms. "I ask you, gentlemen of the peerage, if you were stripped of your lands, if you were mocked in the dark by cowards, would you not pray for a wife with the courage to raise her hand? Would you not want a partner who fights?" He turned his gaze directly to Beatrix. For a moment, it was just the two of them in the room. "I did not marry Lady Beatrix to secure a political alliance," Samuel declared, his voice thick with emotion. "I married her because I have spent my life building an empire of steel, and in her I finally found a spirit that was stronger than the metal I forge. I married her because she is the most honorable person in this room." He turned back to the crowd, his expression hardening into ice. He pointed a finger toward the back of the room directly at Reginald Crowe. "And to the man who sought to blackmail me with this story, to the man who thought he could sell my wife's courage as a scandal." Every head in the room swiveled to look at Crowe. He was pale, sweating, shrinking against the wall as if trying to merge with the wallpaper. "You are not debris, sir," Samuel said coldly. "You are rust, and you have no place among iron." For 3 heartbeats there was silence. Absolute, stunned silence. Then slowly the Duke of Richmond, the host of the ball where the slap had occurred, stood up. He began to clap. Slow, heavy claps. Then the Prime Minister stood up. Then the General of the Army. Within seconds, the Grand Hall erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar of approval. The aristocracy loved a hero, but they loved a redemption story even more. Samuel had taken a moment of shame and transmuted it into a legend of loyalty. Beatrix sat, frozen tears pricking her eyes. He had done it. He hadn't just saved her reputation. He had rewritten who she was in the eyes of the world. She wasn't the spinster Beatrix Weatherby anymore. She was the Countess of Kincaid, the woman with the heart of fire. She watched as the crowd physically turned their backs on Reginald Crowe. The cut direct. In Victorian London, it was a death sentence. No one would invite him. No one would trade with him. He was finished. He turned and fled the hall, a shadow dissolving into the night. The carriage ride home. 11 p.m. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, the rhythmic clatter of hooves, the only sound in the dark interior. The rain had started again, lashing against the glass, blurring the gaslights of London into streaks of gold. Inside, the silence was heavy, but it was no longer the cold silence of their wedding night. It was the breathless silence of survivors. Samuel sat opposite her. His long legs stretched out his head, leaning back against the squabs. He looked exhausted. The adrenaline of the speech had faded, leaving him looking mortal. "You were—" Beatrix started, her voice shaking. "Samuel, you were magnificent." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I was honest. A rare occurrence for a politician, I'm told. You destroyed him. Crow. He will never show his face in society again." "He attacked my wife," Samuel said simply. "He got off lightly." "My wife." He said it with a weight, a possessiveness that made Beatrix's breath hitch. She moved. She didn't think about it. She simply crossed the small space of the carriage and sat on the bench beside him. The sudden proximity seemed to suck the air out of the carriage. "You took a great risk," she said softly. "If they hadn't applauded, if they had laughed, I didn't care." Samuel turned to face her, his knee brushing hers. Halfway through that speech, I realized I didn't care about the seat in the Lords. I didn't care about the Prime Minister. I only wanted to make sure they knew who you really were. I couldn't bear for them to think of you as anything less than extraordinary. Beatrix felt a tear slip down her cheek. She reached out and took his hand. He wasn't wearing gloves now. His skin was warm, his grip strong. "You said you married me because you found a spirit stronger than metal," she whispered. "Was that true, or was that just for the speech?" Samuel looked at her, his gaze intense, stripping away the layers of pretense they had lived under for weeks. "Beatrix," he murmured, "I have been obsessed with you since the moment your hand connected with my face. You woke me up. I was sleepwalking through a life of acquisition and greed, and you slapped me awake." He raised his hand, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. "I don't just admire you," he confessed, his voice rough with vulnerability. "I burn for you. I have spent every night of this marriage pacing the floor of my dressing room, wanting to knock on your door, but terrified that you only saw me as the monster who bought your debt." "I did," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I did see you as a monster, but I was blind." "You are not the monster, Samuel. You are the man who saves the broken things. You saved Leon. You saved my father. And tonight, you saved me." "Then save me back," he whispered. Beatrix didn't hesitate. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't polite. It was a collision of souls. Samuel made a low sound in his throat and pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, crushing the emerald silk against his stiff shirt front. The kiss was desperate, tasting of rain and relief, and a hunger that had been denied for too long. His mouth was hot, demanding his stubble, grazing her chin, igniting a fire that burned through the propriety of the carriage. Beatrix buried her hands in his hair, pulling him deeper, claiming him just as he was claiming her. The carriage hit a bump, jostling them, but they didn't break apart. They only held on tighter, anchoring each other against the swaying world. When they finally pulled back, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other, the carriage was slowing down. They were turning into the gates of Blackwood Manor. "We are home," Beatrix whispered. Samuel looked deep into her eyes, a slow, genuine smile curving his lips, the first true smile of joy she had ever seen on him. "Yes," he said, kissing her hand. "Finally, we are home." They didn't go to separate rooms. Samuel dismissed the valet and the maid at the door. He locked the heavy oak doors of the master suite, shutting out the world, the politics, the debts, and the past. The fire was dying in the grate, casting a soft, amber glow over the room. Beatrix stood by the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, but not from fear. Never again from fear. Samuel walked to her. He didn't rush. He reached out and slowly began to undo the buttons of his waistcoat, tossing it onto a chair. Then he turned her around his fingers deftly, working the laces of her gown. "You are free, Beatrix," he murmured against her shoulder as the heavy silk pooled at her feet. "The debt is cancelled. You can leave if you wish. You can take the money and go." Beatrix turned in his arms, clad only in her chemise, and looked up at the man who had been her enemy, her captor, and was now her savior. "I am not going anywhere, Samuel," she said, placing her hand over his heart. "I am exactly where I belong." He picked her up, then carrying her to the bed, not as a prize he had purchased, but as a treasure he had earned. And as the Iron Earl laid down his armor to hold his wife, Beatrix realized that the man in the library had been right about one thing: she had spirit. But he had been wrong about the rest. She wasn't a broken horse. She was the only one who could run alongside him. The candle flickered and went out, leaving them in the darkness, no longer a place of hiding, but a sanctuary for a love that had been forged in fire. And so the scandal that threatened to ruin them became the foundation of a legacy. Samuel and Beatrix proved that true honor isn't about being polite. It's about standing up for the ones you love, even if you have to slap some sense into the world to do it. If this story of enemies to lovers, high-stakes blackmail and Victorian passion kept you on the edge of your seat, please, like this video, it really helps the channel grow. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next romance saga. And tell me in the comments, do you think Samuel would have paid the money if Beatrix hadn't stopped him? I'll see you in the next story.